Okay, so I'm gonna record it. Yeah, you're gonna stay, is that what you're?
Yeah, I
Okay.
got a couple of questions. too.
Okay, good, all right. So, whatever order, Randy, do you wanna go ahead?
Can you go over a legal description reading? It's a,
Yeah, so we won't have that on the final, but you can
Oh,
get that,
great.
no, but you can get that at the state exam. So this is reading a legal description? No, so give me a sense of what we're looking at here. What you're, like reading it backwards to come up with the location, or?
well, you have an example here. It says a legal description reading, the E one half
Yeah,
of the northeast,
that'd be the east half of the northeast, go ahead.
1/4 of section 7 consists of,
Oh, like how much land?
yeah,
Okay, so to calculate the amount of area in a legal description, it comes back to understanding that there's 160 acres, or excuse me, 640 acres in a section, and that's the basis of the legal description. So read me that legal description again. It's the east half, you said?
yes, east half of the northeast 1/4 of section 7.
Okay, stop there. Now is there an and in there, or is it just that one piece?
Just that one piece.
Okay, so that's all that I need to know.
Okay.
So the math for this is gonna be the section is 640 acres. And that was cut in half, so times a half. And then that was cut in a quarter, times a quarter. So that's all I need. The rest of the information is distracting.
Okay.
You don't care what township it's in, which state it's in, you don't care anything else about it. Every section of land is 640 acres, that's what 1 square mile is. And the legal description, we just look at the halves, the quarters, whatever they do in there, and every one of those is a multiplication. So when you multiply that out, then you would get what, 320, and then you get 80? Is that right? Should be 80 acres. See, I like that kind of math question, but not everybody does, obviously.
Okay.
85 acres?
No, it should be 80, right? 60 times a half is 320, and then a quarter of 320 is 80. So my math for a calculator would be this: 640 times 0.5 times 0.25 equals 80. Another way to do that is 640 divided by 2, right? And then you take that and you multiply that, or you divide that by 4, right? So, I mean, I don't know if that's even the right way to put a fraction like that. So, anyway, you just take these one step at a time. In my head, I'm taking 640 and I'm cutting it in half, and that gets me 320. Then I take the 320 and divide that by 4, and I get, oh, that's 80. That's how I came up with that in my head.
Okay, so it's answer A, but it says 80 acre parcel, and then B also says 80 acre parcel. And then with A, it says measuring approximately 1,320 feet
Ah,
by 2,640 feet.
so that's asking you to look at land area measures a couple different ways.
Yeah,
So if you know that there's 560 square feet in an acre, you can take 80 times 43,560 to get the total number of square feet, right? Whatever that is. 2 of those answers in that problem are just mathematically impossible, because if you multiply the length times width of the land area, they won't equal 80 acres or 160 acres or 40 or whatever's on there. So that's where that's kind of tricky, because you're accepting that the math within the answer is accurate. That's an assumption you don't want to make,
exactly.
right? Because I can write an answer that clearly disqualifies itself if you understand the math but don't understand the principle, which is what you've got there. So again, let me just kind of state it to anybody who looks at this. This is unit test 2, right? And we're looking at question 36. So on question 36 on your practice unit test 2, if you take 1320 by 2640, that's going to give you something different than 660 by 1320. They're not both 80 acre parcels. So B is an impossibility, because I think that's only a 40 acre piece, maybe even only 20, no, it's only 40 acres. And then of the next 2, I think the same thing may be true. C and D, if you take the feet divided by 43,560, you'll find out that they don't even equal that number of acres. You're welcome, if that's helpful.
I have a question
Yes.
on the test,
Which one?
which is chapter, I think it's test 3.
Okay.
No, test 1. Number 27. How much principal is repaid in the first monthly payment made on the following loan?
Yeah, so that would be exactly like the math
That's the
question.
one
you
we
could-
did, but
Yes,
the interest rate is 7.125.
okay.
So how do I do that with the decimal? How do I
Well,
do
that's it. If it's 7.125, it's 7 1/8, is that what it is?
7.125.
Yeah, so that's what you do wanna use. You wanna use that, so it's gonna be 0.07125. So here's what that could look like. So 7 1/8 equals 7.125% equals 0.07125. Those are all the same number. Now, for those of us who don't know what all the fractions are, if you know that there's a 7, right, so 7, right, is gonna equal 7% for the interest rate. So that part's okay. So then the question is, what's the eighth worth? And this is a fraction, this is a division problem. 1 divided by 8 equals 0.125. So I can tell that 7 1/8 equals 7.125, and it's an interest rate, so I just put percentage. And anytime you have a percentage, it's this number divided by 100. That's what percentage means. Right, por ciento, per 100, for every 100. So it's you know, por ciento dividido por ciento. So it's divided by 100. So you're converting it that way. Well, if you already know that it's, you know, if the problem tells you the decimal or whatever, just add the percent and hit your percent key to get that answer that you need. If the greater challenge, I think, Cecilia, is if it tells it to you in a fraction like this, and you can get financing down to the 32nd, probably not a mortgage loan, but I mean, some things in finances are in 16ths and 32nds. So the only way to convert that to a percentage is to understand that the fraction is itself a division problem. The number on the top divided by the number on the bottom will result in a decimal. Add that decimal to the whole number, and that'll give you the rest of the percentage. I don't remember what I can't even tell you whether I'm giving you like an eighth or a quarter or a half or a whole number on the interest on the final. I just don't remember. It's a good question. Go ahead, Georgia, did you have a question too? You wanted to
Yeah,
add?
no, I have a few. All right, let's see, there's some different exemptions to the Illinois Human Rights Act.
Yes.
I should have the question on that. I should have the page, let me look that up first,
Okay.
okay?
All right.
Well, it had something to do, oh, I know, it had something to do with the units. The 4 units and under occupied by the owner.
Oh, all right, so, right. Mhm.
Okay, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Answer it. All right, so, let's say you're living in your own apartment building, all right, and you
Yes.
have 4 units.
Yes.
So this, none of the acts apply to it, or does the Civil Rights Act of 1866 still apply to it?
Yeah, it does. So the Civil Rights Act of 1866 has no exceptions.
Okay, that's what
So, assuming somebody without a real estate license is the owner of a 4-flat, right? This is the Mrs. Murphy's exemption. You can rent to anybody you want. You can say no disabled, no kids, no men, whatever. You can make all those decisions you want. The one you cannot make that decision on is race. But even there, if somebody filed a complaint with HUD, HUD would do nothing except refer them to the Department of Justice, because the Fair Housing Act would allow you to discriminate based upon race, as I interpret it, under the Mrs. Murphy's exemption. It's the Civil Rights Act of 1866 that will not allow it. So it takes going to the Department of Justice, filing a complaint with them, having them litigate in federal court in order to bring a claim of action, like any other civil rights law.
So basically,
Yeah, the way
there's no exemption. to
Yeah,
the
for
first
race,
act.
right, for race, on a broad brush basis, there's basically no exemption.
And then like at the state board, that's what I'm thinking of question-wise.
Oh, yeah.
You would know, like, normally you could take the exemption, but it gives race instead of.
Yeah, I'm not sure,
sex or whatever.
again, the test question would have to reference that it was clearly asking you only what does the Federal Fair Housing Act say, or only what does the Illinois Human Rights Act say, because those don't care. You know, those grant the exemption, they grant the exemption. It's only the Civil Rights Act of 1866 that does not grant the exemption.
Okay, so they would be asking you which one.
So, yeah, so it would have to be specific enough that you wouldn't get tripped up on that
Okay,
level
I
of
thought they
distance.
just want you to know that you can
Yeah.
never.
Well, in the most general sense, it is accurate to say you can never discriminate based upon race. That's completely correct. If I were asking you to explain to me or demonstrate to me that you know why that's the case, then it would have to involve the Civil Rights Act of 1866 on some basis. I had a woman in this class, previous version of this class, who was African American and a lawyer who worked for HUD. And we got into this discussion, maybe it wasn't this course, but a different level, broker level course, and I was fascinated by the fact that she would say, oh yeah, if somebody comes to us and files a complaint on race for an owner-occupied, 1, 2, 3, or 4 unit property, we just turn them away. Because they still have a hard time grasping that that's not, but HUD's focus is only on the Federal Fair Housing Act. They don't administer the civil rights, any other civil rights legislation.
Okay.
Right, so if you come to HUD and file a complaint, they're gonna say, that's an owner-occupied property, that's not an area that we can touch.
Wow.
Yeah, that was my reaction.
Okay.
But in
Yeah, 'cause
general,
it's
I
just
would
hard
rather,
it's hard to understand. It's kind of like, I've got one more too with
yeah,
Megan's
no,
Law.
that's fine, yeah.
All right, with Megan's Law, that's with the sexual predators
Yeah.
living in the area.
Uh-huh.
Now, if we list the property with a seller, there's no, we don't have to disclose anything.
You don't have to disclose anything at all through Megan's Law.
But what about if you're a buyer?
Yeah, if you're repping a buyer, refer them to the sheriff's department. Refer them to the website to go to check that out on their
Like,
own.
you don't do that every time you sell a house, do you? I'm
Well-
just trying to figure out how you.
I would, if I was working today and doing much buyer agency in residential at all, I would have, other than occasionally with a friend or somebody like that who's finding a property and then calling me, I would have a checklist that I would walk through with my buyers when I was first talking with them and disclosing agency, giving them the written agency disclosures and things. And part of that would be, if you're interested in these things, crime stats, sexual offender location, school ratings, whatever, here's the whole range of websites or other places you might want to contact. So that you push them off on all of those how are the neighborhood questions
Okay,
right
so
at the very
we
beginning.
don't look them up and give them to them.
No, not at all, because as soon as you do that, you take on the liability. And statistically, it's been demonstrated that only half offenders register, so it's impossible for you to be accurate, and you don't want to get sued. Remember, litigation is usually all about where'd the money go, and the agents get the biggest chunk of the typical deal. So you don't want to give somebody a reason to chase you for those commission dollars. So you're better off in those cases referring them to a source like, the sheriff's website. And that's why I would just have a sheet, and your office may already have this when you go there, or ask around the other brokers when you.
Well, that's funny,
find
because
a
I was
place.
just talking to my son about this the other night, and I said, I'm gonna need a checklist.
Yes.
When I'm going through
Checklists
this,
are really
so you
good.
remember them.
This
Check-
is your checklist right here.
So
Well,
there you go.
partly.
The terms.
But partly, no, but for practice, it's true. It's, and it depends upon where you're gonna practice is what those are. So for me, if I'm doing a lot of property management, then it's things like the move in and move out checklist, and it's other, it's credit applications, it's different stuff. Whereas if you're representing buyers and sellers on residential property, even there, you may have one set of checklists for a seller and a different set of checklists for a buyer. That's why I recommend people specialize. It's much easier to get really good as a buyer's agent if that's all you do. And then when you get somebody who wants the list, you have to think, do I really want to take this listing when I haven't listed a house in 6 months or a year, or do I want to refer them to another broker in my office, get 25 or 35 or 50% or whatever you can get of that deal, and let them handle it, because habits are of value, right?
Right. So
So when I started out, I did everything. Now I try and do, just really very limited kinds of things. But even there, it's pretty wide ranging, because when somebody who knows me, calls me, I'm showing condos in the loop or something else, and they'll ask me a question like, hey, what floor is the exercise room on? And I look at them and I go, I've never been in this stinking building before, I have no idea. So we'll go up and down in the elevator for a while, If it's a 50-story building, we don't ride up and down the elevator a lot. I go straight to the front desk and ask, right? But I was in an 8-story the other day, and we went every floor. Never did find it, and then I realized, oh, this is a multiple building complex. The exercise room was in a whole other building. But I wouldn't embarrass myself like that. If I was, doing this on a full-time basis, I would have done the homework ahead of time. But those are the kinds of things you just make business decisions along the way. Where do I want to concentrate? How do I want to do stuff? And checklists are part of that.
I got a couple more, maybe you guys want to just answer mine.
Did you go over Ginnie Mae?
Yeah, Ginnie Mae,
Oh, Ginnie Mae?
Ginnie Mae itself as opposed to Freddie Mae and Fannie Mac,
Yeah.
Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac?
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't think you get a Fannie or Freddie question at the state exam, because those situations are still in limbo. Congress has to resolve that, and the last I heard, which is probably now 6 or 7 years ago from DPR, was no Fannie or Freddie questions on the state exam in Illinois until they get that resolved. Ginnie Mae, however, has never changed. So HUD, right, has oversees various divisions, has things within it like FHA and other sorts of things. So one of the things that Ginnie Mae has always done is Ginnie Mae will issue what's called a pass-through certificate in the secondary market. Ginnie Mae has never purchased mortgages. So instead of buying them, taking title to them, and reselling them like Fannie and Freddie do, Ginnie Mae simply stands in between the lender on like an FHA loan, a VA loan, the Indian Health Service, or not Health Service, but Indian Housing Service, and rural housing, whatever else you have. And so in a Ginnie Mae deal, they guarantee that loan without ever taking title to it, or they guarantee the income stream on it. So Ginnie Mae is a division of HUD. It's part of the federal government, and they guarantee to whomever the investor is that's buying that pool of mortgages, insurance company, sovereign wealth fund, deep-pocketed net worth individual, that they're going to get whatever the income is, regardless of what happens to the loans in the portfolio. So if the loans in the portfolio are defaulted upon, it doesn't matter, Ginnie Mae will make those whole. And it's an interesting thing because as I understand it, Ginnie Mae is actually only guaranteeing the income stream to investors on loans, on pools of mortgages where the loans themselves are already federally backed. FHA loans are insured. VA loans are partially guaranteed. So I'm not sure that Ginnie Mae takes a whole lot of risk because they're just kind of duplicating.
Kind of facilitating?
Yeah, they're facilitating bringing money into those deals. And right now, Braden, it makes no sense to really try and figure out why they're there, because Fannie and Freddie are both 80% owned by the federal government. Therefore, the guarantee that they provide is just as good as you get if you bought treasury bills, notes, or bonds. But the original creation of Fannie and Freddie was that they were completely privately held, publicly traded companies where you and I could buy stock, so it was just owned by a bunch of mom and pop Americans. And the federal government was only kind of a hint that if something went wrong, it might step in to clean up the mess. And today, we're still in the middle of the cleanup. So Ginnie Mae is kind of a superfluous thing, but eventually what will happen, something will be done with Fannie and Freddie. They will be eliminated, or they will be recapitalized and resold out, into the stock market again. But Ginnie Mae will probably continue to stay there and do exactly what it does, issue those pass-through certificates guaranteeing the income stream to the investors who end up, buying those mortgage-backed pools, on the FHA, the VA, and the rural loans, etc.
I got one more.
Oh, that's all right. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Actually, it's like one question contains 17 parts. I was going through, I think it's chapter 16, and there's like 17 different types of loans and mortgages. How many of these do we need to know in detail of how they work?
All right, so as I recall from your final exam, I'm going a little bit by memory, this to some degree you have to go back to what I said Thursday night, but you should, the things that jump out at me as loans that you're likely to see or that I want you to understand something about. What's a package loan? A blanket loan? An ARM? A balloon? Those are probably the biggest things there. Then there's the purchase money mortgage, which is really kind of like a second mortgage with a note, take it back. So that's also, I think, something like that on there. So I would say those things, and that's all that kind of latter half of chapter 16 stuff, right, where there's a bunch of different things. Definitely no questions on wraps, nothing on gems. I don't care about reverse mortgages. The real estate agents don't get involved in those. Honestly, I don't even understand why it's in the text. And so, yeah, so I think that's pretty much it. Blanket loan being for subdivisions and condo conversions, package loans being for buying vacation property, furnished property of any kind, like a builder's model. ARMs, being how the financing adjusts at some point in time. the balloon being like we have in commercial loans, you pay it for 3 years and then the entire thing is due in full. So if you can identify those in a purchase money mortgage for the final, you're good. I cannot tell you at all on the state exam where to draw that line, except to tell you that 2/3 of the people who pass this course pass the state exam on the first try. So what I would do is when you pass this course, I would just schedule while the information's fresh, go take the state exam. Worst case, you're not ready, you blow $46, but the other advantage to having done that is you've now seen the test. So you now know a much better sense of what to expect. You go back to your cubbyhole and study a little more, and then you're better prepared the next time around.
Okay.
Go ahead, Steve.
One of the questions I keep getting wrong, and I don't know if it's opposites in my brain, but what's a debit and what's a credit and closing statements?
All right, so coming down on a debit and credit closing statement question, I do not recommend that you try and memorize the diagrams in chapter 23 because it's just too sterile and too arbitrary. So I look at a closing statement myself, and unfortunately the textbook used to but no longer has an example of a closing statement in it. But the closing statement basically is saying that any money that comes to me or that I bring to the closing or that is paid on my behalf at the closing, that's a credit. And any money that leaves my side of the transaction or that I'm paying, then that's a debit. So as a buyer, you start off with nothing but debits because everything's a cost. You have the cost of the purchase is a debit. All of your closing costs on your loan are all debits because it all drives up the cost of purchasing. Any prepaids you have to come up with, like prepaying the homeowner's insurance or prepaying any interest or prepaying the tax escrow, all those are debits because you might as well pay that much more for the house because it's driving up the amount of money you need at the closing table. Then your down payment or earnest money, any money that's given to you by the seller, and the loan money that you borrow, all of those are credits because that's all cash being thrown onto the table by you or by somebody else. So that's kind of the buyer's side of the transaction.
So the best way to remember it is if it's leaving your pocket, it's a debit to you. If it's coming to you, it's a credit to you.
Correct.
It works on the other side the same way.
Correct, exactly. So for the seller, the biggest debit is paying off the existing loan, plus whatever other a few other recording fees, attorney's costs, a few small costs like that. The big credit to the seller is the purchase price. That's the big incoming. In fact, for a seller, the typical thing is you only get one credit. It's just the purchase price. Every once in a while, you'll have some other nominal thing like something you paid in advance where the buyer owes you a little money, or I've done some commercial deals where I don't remember how we even worked this, but there was credit to the seller for some additional days of whatever in the deal was done, which was a little bit odd. Normally, again, a seller is just going to get the one, at least in Illinois, it's just going to get the one credit.
So prepaying the interest or prepaying the insurance and the taxes is a debit to the buyer, but it's nothing to the seller.
Correct, because the seller's not affected by it. And it's and those prepaid, right? And those prepaid debits like that aren't really a cost to the buyer. I hate to use the word cost because you got to pay those eventually anyway, right? And when you sell that house in the future, then the buyer's going to, the person who's the buyer today, in the future is going to have to deal with the taxes on whatever basis they're at later, right? I mean, you might still be behind on them. So. Yeah, anyway, money out of your pocket is a debit. Money coming into you or paid by somebody else, like even a lender, is a credit. That's the easiest way to remember it.
Okay, that's good.
Is that one of yours?
Yeah. I have one more.
Yeah, please go
All
ahead.
right, client versus consumer versus customer versus principal. Some of those are so close, I can't.
All right, so let's start with principal because we can separate that out. The principal is the client. The principal is either a buyer or a seller or a tenant or a landlord, period. They're a party to the actual sale or lease transaction. That's the principal. So now let's deal with the confusing terms of consumer, customer, and client. And I'm going to deal with customer and client first and then explain why we even define the term consumer. So a client is the party that we represent. Whatever principal I'm representing as an agent, that's the client. That's my client. and I had that full range of client duties. A customer, on the other hand, is someone involved in the transaction on some level, somebody that I'm doing something for, whether it's actually come to a transaction yet or just has the potential to come to a transaction, somebody I'm doing something for, but who is not my client.
Can you give an example of that?
Yes. You come to my open house. I have a listing, and I've got, in fact, it's somebody else's listing, and I'm just sitting in the open house for them. And you walk in and you just want information about the property, right? At that moment in time, you're a customer because I don't owe you any duties, right? It's ministerial acts. You're asking a bunch of questions. I owe you fair and honest dealing and that kind of thing, but I don't owe you. If that place sells the next, I get an offer the next morning at 8 o'clock, I do not owe you a phone call saying, hey, Steve, thanks for coming to the open house. By the way, it's my fiduciary duty to tell you there's an offer on that place you seem to have interest in, right? Whereas if you were my client and I caught wind of the fact, you were my buyer client, and I caught wind of the fact that there was an offer on a place, it would be my fiduciary duty to disclose that to you and call you and say, hey, by the way, if you're interested, they're presenting offers today. Right? Does that make a little sense? So it's also the party on the other side of the table from you. And this is a bit of a stretch, I think, for some brokers, but this is how I interpret the license law. So I owe fair and honest dealing and skill and care and whatever else to the party I'm not representing on the other side of the transaction, like accounting. So if I'm holding the buyer's earnest money as a managing or sponsoring broker, I owe an accounting not just to my client, the seller, but to the buyer, who's not my client at all, but that makes them my customer. So I owe them fairness, fair and honest dealing, I owe them reasonable skill and care, and I owe them accounting to a customer. A customer can also be somebody that, for whatever reason, you're going to do something for, but you just don't want to represent them. So this would be an example, I best I can give you from my experience, is a woman in my office who 1 year sold her parents' house, next year her brother's house, next year her sister's house. She could legally do dual agency on any of those, but she never wanted to. So she would have people sign a disclosure when she would show them the place. This is a family member's listing. I don't want to represent you. Don't give me any confidential information, but I'll take you through and show you the place. So that's where you're, for whatever reason, you want to separate yourself from somebody. Again, you still owe them fair and honest dealing. You would still owe them accounting for any paperwork if they sign and make an offer or whatever, but you don't owe them, obedience or loyalty or those kinds of things. So that's really what a customer is the difference between a customer and a client. Now, consumer, the word consumer simply exists so we can use something other than the word human being. It's a way to define somebody within the context of the license law who we're not trying to describe as either a customer or a client. So a consumer is just somebody who's probably going to be seeking some kinds of services, but we cannot yet define them as customer or client. It's just another word to use so we don't mistakenly refer to somebody as a client who isn't yet, or a customer who maybe even isn't yet. Does that make some sense? Consumer is just a generic word defined by the Act to be a way to refer to a person without also calling them a customer or a client. So you would never represent a consumer, nobody does, because a consumer isn't, by definition, yet being represented, or if they are, it's immaterial to, because if they're being represented by somebody, they're either your client or they're somebody else's client, which might make them your customer.
At what point in the customer relationship do you have to worry about dual agency?
Immediately. So
you should say that I represent the other side, but
yeah, so the trick anytime you're talking with somebody about a property you already have listed, or if you've got a buyer you have in tow and you're talking to a for sale by owner about showing their property, the first thing you have to do is warn them about confidential information, because you are obligated to disclose to your client every piece of relevant information that you know in a timely manner. So because that's an automatic, inherent fiduciary duty, you have to stop consumers who are not your client from saying something they shouldn't if they realize, oh, I shouldn't have said that because now you have to go tell your seller or now you have to go tell your buyer. So important reason for disclosing agency upfront and very promptly and doing it in writing is so the other party understands, if I want to give this person a bunch of confidential information, I need to have this I need to sign this dual agency disclosure. The typical scenario here is where you're already repping the seller and a buyer calls on your sign or your internet ad or whatever, and they want to come see your listing. You can caution them over the phone, but you want to have paperwork ready when they hit the front door. It's a little bit awkward, and it's not really very sexy in terms of sales, smoothness, but you really need to take them immediately to the dining room table or the kitchen counter or whatever and say, now, give me just a couple of minutes, I got to explain this agency stuff to you. And the main thing there, even if they say, well, I'm not ready to sign everything, but the main thing is to tell them, I have a disclosure for you then that says, I don't represent you. You're the only one who signs it. Don't give me any confidential information that you don't want me to run back to my seller with.
Until you have some seasoning, would you be better off in dual agency to say, maybe you should bring a realtor with you?
Or referring, don't just tell them to bring an agent if they don't already, always ask, do you have an agent? Always, always, always ask. That's an important thing. It allows you to avoid interfering with somebody else's exclusive relationship if they have it. It also, more importantly, maybe to you, helps you avoid wasting your time. Because you don't want to spend a lot of time with somebody whose twin sister is a broker. They're just calling you for information. And maybe they're busy and now you're showing the property, not find out later that they've got this sort of agent in their pocket who just doesn't want to take the time to be bothered until there's an actual deal on the horizon. So you always want to find out, do they have an agent? Then after that, you want to make sure if they don't have an agent that you bring them into your fold. But if you don't want to represent them, refer them to somebody so you can make a deal there with another agent in your office to keep a quarter or a third or whatever the typical thing is as part of that transaction, right? So you can make a little bit of money every year by just doing referrals. And that's a great way to avoid dual agency. So a buyer calls you up, want to see the property, say, I really don't want to show you the property because it's my listing. Do you mind if I hand you off to another agent here in the office? I just need your name, telephone number, and if you can give me that, hold on a couple minutes and I'll see if Susie's available or whatever. And just have that set up with somebody else that you know. And 25% in residential is very common, it's very easy. On local deals, sometimes you can keep as much as 50% of a referral.
It's not the same as a designated agent, is it?
No, the designated agent is between the sponsoring broker and you as the sponsored licensee. The sponsoring broker designates you basically. Remember that was the deal where you go to list your mom's house, and at that listing, based upon the power given to you in your written employment contract, where you're a general agent for the broker, you name yourself as your mom's designated agent on behalf of the broker. So that's what designated agency is about. Designated agency is about a way for the sponsoring broker to avoid dual agency, is you're designated as mom's rep. So when I bring a buyer, even though I'm at the same, sponsored by the same firm, it's not dual agency because I got the buyer and you got the seller.
Oh. Okay.
That's what designated agency is all about.
So basically, every time you do a transaction, that you're the designated agent for your
broker,
For your
every
broker.
time, right. And that designated agency must be disclosed in writing to either a buyer or a seller. So even in buyer agency, where we're typically too lazy to get written agency, exclusive agency agreements, we do have to provide them with a written disclosure. They don't have to sign it, but that would be one of those things you want to have sort of with you, a form with you, so that if you run into somebody and you need to disclose that, you want to be able to just fill it out and sign it and hand it off to them. A copy of that then goes back to your broker at the office. That's a requirement for them to keep that for audit and record keeping purposes. Other questions? Yeah,
Okay.
take your time.
Affordability.
Okay.
All right, you said that in chapter 3, you were gonna ask us about affordability. What basically were you looking at?
I will not. I will, in
28% of the person?
in chapter 3, I'm only going to ask you about the capital gains tax. I will not ask you about affordability.
Oh, okay.
In practice, if you're going to rep buyers, you'll want to understand that affordability process. But rather than confuse you now, it's probably better to just,
What, is
figure out.
that 28%,
Yes.
36%?
28% of your gross monthly income
Okay.
is sort of like the bottom threshold for the Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac conventional loans, where if I'm making 10 grand a month, principal, interest, taxes, and interest, I should be able to afford a house of $2,800 a month, 28% times
Do
that
you
10
do that
grand.
with everybody before you start showing them houses?
You have one of two choices. You should either pre-qualify them, well, you have several choices. One, ask them, have you ever been pre-qualified? If they say, oh yes, we're already approved by a lender, just ask them for a copy of their paperwork whenever they can get it to you, but you're probably good to go. Again, the whole idea with pre-qualification is to not waste your time, but also not get their hopes up and show them stuff it turns out they can't afford. So either you want to pre-qualify them or you want a lender or somebody. So if you know somebody, for example, who's working for a mortgage broker or working at a bank, you might say, you know what, why don't you go over and see so-and-so. For a while, we was at a real estate office where we were in a building that had a bank. And then for a while, we had our own in-house mortgage person. So I could send them to the bank on the first floor, I could send them across the hall to our in-house mortgage person, or I could refer them to a mortgage broker I really liked, and he could do it over the phone. Eventually, I just learned to do it myself. You know, it wasn't that big a deal.
How did you find all these different lenders? Did you like go out and like introduce yourself and?
No, lenders will come to you. They'll come around. They may send you emails. They may show up at various events or things or whatever. I get emails from lenders all the time. I probably literally get an email from a lender every day about something, just from having been around. Your email address as a broker will become public information very
so
quickly.
people are sending you stuff.
Yeah.
And then you can meet them and whatever.
And then
you have to give three.
And,
right?
yeah, I would for liability avoidance, it's best to recommend a 3 because that way people can choose. Your buyers are then choosing where to go. And all you want is something you just want somebody who's reasonable and trustworthy. After that, to be able to figure out what's the screaming best loan program at any moment in time is it's categorically impossible because rates are changing by the minute during trading hours. Whatever.
You need to get pre-approved for purchasing a property subject to the mortgage.
Well, I would recommend that you get pre-approved. And when you get a mortgage commitment, it's not a guarantee that they're going to loan you the money, but it's pretty close to that, right? It's an indication, and what you're trying to do really there is show the seller our people have gone through the application process, they have been approved, subject to certain conditions, and as long as nothing changes, as long as everything is what checks out to be what we think it is, then they'll do that. But even a pre-approval really isn't what it might sound like. Not everything has been necessarily checked or verified. And so some of that stuff still has to be done, and you may find out that, we didn't realize that 20% of your income here was bonus, and we don't count bonus. Or we didn't realize that 20% of it is overtime, and we don't want to count on overtime. And again, so like for me, my income is lumpy because if I have some big leasing commissions or some big sale that I wasn't counting on a given year, I make X this year, I make 2X the next year, and then I'm back to 3/4 of X a year after that. How do you figure out what my kind of average is? So I might have pre-qualified at one point for this. 3 months later, because I'm into a different tax year, I might qualify for something different. So part of that too is timing and how old is the approval and whatever. So you have to look at the specific terms of the mortgage commitment also, because the mortgage commitment might say no condos, for example, or whatever. And all of a sudden you're taking somebody to townhouses that happen to be a condo form of ownership, and the loan commitment's no good. That lender won't do it. They'll do it for a higher rate or for more money down or whatever.
They don't tell them in pre-approval, like if there's dings on their credit score?
Yeah, I think so.
Oh, so then you can work with them
Yeah.
to try and get those
Yeah.
cleared up.
Yeah, that's so that part of it's the advantage, right? At least their credit gets pulled because when you pay the application fee at that point in time, that's one of the things that contributes towards is pulling your credit. And again, ultimately, what you want to be able to do is get yourself to a point where you're encouraging your buyers to run their own credit. You really, if I were teaching a personal finance course, I would tell everybody, get a copy of your own credit report before the course is over, because being able to look at who's out there and what your credit score is, etc., is a big deal. I check my credit score every 3 to 4 months.
Do you pay for that? Because everyone I've ever looked at says, I'll give you the credit report, but the credit score is not included.
Yeah, when you go to annualcreditreport.com, which is the federally mandated site, the law does not require a credit score, just a credit report. Besides pulling that, then every time one of my credit cards is hacked at Target, at Home Depot, whatever, you bet I'll take the free credit monitoring service because that usually includes scores. And then I found kind of a love-hate relationship with a company called Quizzle, which is a part of Quicken Loans. I went online one day to try and get some information, and that click was a one-click thing, and all of a sudden, next thing you know, my phone was ringing, and I had 4 or 5 lenders calling me. And I tell them, oh, look, I thought I was just getting information, I wasn't actually, and they said, oh, no, you clicked on a link that applied for a loan. I said, well, that ain't what I'm doing. So, as part of that, with Quicken, they end up signing me into stuff for this Quizzle, and they'll let me check my credit score for free every 3 or 4 months. I just have to put up with a crap load of emails from them every third day telling me I should refinance or whatever. So yeah, if you hunt around enough, Credit Karma, I think, is one that people like. Definitely not freecreditreport.com, because that's just, that's just an advertising spam site. But Credit Karma, people seem to like. Is that the one that's on TV? They advertise, I think, too? Yeah. It's not as accurate, you think? I mean, it depends. I mean, you have 3 different main credit agencies, so you could have 3 different credit scores. And then, Steve, there's a question: if you're married or partnered up or whatever, you both need to be checking, right? Because if you're going to apply together, if your credit score is 800 but your partner's is 650, then that can kind of mess up what you're trying to do also. So, like, I check mine regularly. My wife doesn't check hers hardly at all. Ours has usually typically been pretty close because a lot of our stuff is joint, but I don't know whether her credit score is the same as mine right now.
I have one more.
Yeah, please.
And then I'm done. Okay, the lead-based paint. All right. If we represent a seller, we need to disclose that if there's a problem before 1978, those homes.
Yeah, you need to disclose not only if there's a problem, but you need to even disclose whether you know or not there's a problem and whether you know of any tests on the house. So the disclosure form says, I am or am not aware of any problems, I am or am not aware of any previous tests.
Okay, but they're not required to get the test.
No, there's no requirement to test whatsoever.
So then the buyer's agent, then they've got what, a couple weeks or?
It's 10 days,
They have
yeah.
10 days to get a test on the paint
Right.
if they want it.
Correct. And I've never seen a buyer want one, honestly, because most buyers don't have cash, to do that. Older housing tends to be less expensive, tends to be where the first-time buyers go, or lower socioeconomic folks go. So to come up with $500 or $1,000 or whatever it's going to be for a test, I've never seen it done.
But it is the seller's responsibility, not the seller,
Well,
the
the
buyer's responsibility if they choose to.
Correct. The seller cannot withhold the buyer's federally mandated right to have a lead paint inspection. Seller can refuse to sell the property, but a seller cannot refuse to let the buyer test. So the buyer has that right. It's built into our standard multi-board contract here as well in the same time frame. But very rarely is it actually done. Sellers have no obligation to test. Your obligation as an agent on either side of that transaction is to make sure that lead paint and you booklet that I showed you around a class, whatever it's called, that the EPA put out, that's been handed off to the buyer, and because at least one agent has to sign off on that lead paint disclosure.
So that and the radon you
Yeah,
have.
and radon is Illinois specific and only for residential. All residential property, there's a few exceptions. I wouldn't bother to study the exceptions though. Just all residential property in Illinois, but again, that's Illinois specific thing. So like at the state exam, if there's a radon disclosure question, it's an Illinois question because I don't even know if there's radon disclosure required in other states. Any other questions? These are all very good, very pointed questions, by the way. I mean, they're really on target.
Okay, guys, good luck.
Good luck,
I just
everyone.
have one.
All right,
I
ladies
need
and
to-
gentlemen, so I'll either see
I
you
need to
tomorrow
set
or
up-
Thursday or whatever people are doing. What do
Do
you,
my test.
yeah, so what do you want to do for,
I just want to do it earlier.
okay, so the easiest thing for me to do, I'm gonna shut this off.